Ladies and gentlemen, just so this afternoon, Dr. Mueller is here to speak to you guys about Mere Christianity. He is a professor at Concordia University, and he will be asking some questions. He'll also be telling you some stuff about the book that you read. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. I'll try to get the mic to you, and that'll be the easiest way to do that. You guys ready? All right, Dr. Mueller.
See, that's faith when you clap for someone who hasn't done anything at all yet. So thanks for having me here today. I'm really glad to be with you and to talk with you a little bit about C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity. So just an honest question. How many people found Mere Christianity hard to read? Okay. How many people liked it? How many people thought it was okay? All right. Who didn't like it? Okay. Thanks for being honest. So interesting stuff. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about C.S. Lewis in background and what he was trying to do in Mere Christianity. We'll pull out a couple of ideas from it, but I mostly want to leave it up for discussion with you about, first of all, what questions you have about this or other things he's written, and then how we apply it ourselves into the world we live in and the lives that we have. So a number of years ago, there was a book published called 100 Christian Books That Changed the Century. It was just kind of across all of Christianity, what was the most important things. And C.S. Lewis ended up having, I think, three different books make the list. One of them was Mere Christianity, which was way high on the list. Screwtape Letters, which is what 6th and 7th read. And then they cheated. They added 7 books altogether and said the Chronicles of Narnia was on another one. So there were more books by him than any other person as the most influential Christians of the century. And that's not an understatement. I think whether we read C.S. Lewis or not, Christians have been influenced by C.S. Lewis, both in what he said and then in how other people have used some of his arguments and methods to communicate today. And Mere Christianity has, I think, the most important argument that he has in there for the case of Christianity. So we'll take a quick look at that as we go along. But it's also important, I think, to recognize we're reading someone who wrote quite a while ago. So, the last class asked, what would C.S. Lewis be doing if he was alive today? And I thought something like nothing, because he'd be 122 years old. He was born at 1898 in Northern Ireland, so a lot of years and a different culture away from us. And so some of the things that we read don't always connect quite so directly to where we are today. Some of the things we read, we forget that we speak English, but there's kind of 2 different versions of English. And so I've often found that American readers sometimes will struggle over parts of the book, not because of what it's saying, but just because the vocabulary that it's using is a little bit different between England and the United States. And other people just try to contextualize a little bit. So a bit about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was born into a Christian family. But when he was about 10 years old, his mother died. And that's a hard thing for anybody. At the same time, within a few months, he was sent away to boarding school. Now, for someone at kind of his level of society at that point in the United Kingdom, boarding school was normal. His brother had already been going to boarding school. That was the typical thing for people to do. He was sent to a boarding school not in Northern Ireland where he lived, but in England. So it was, a boat ride across, and it was, some difficulty to get there. But that distance from family at the same time as his mother died had a big impact on him. He also wasn't sent to great schools. There were a lot of problems there, some abuse and some other things. And in the process of that and some other things, losing his mom and difficult times and him questioning things and frankly some really bad teachers, he was raised a Christian, but gradually his faith started disappearing. But by the time he got to what would be high school for us, he was telling people he was an atheist, wasn't having anything to do with Christianity, and that's how he lived his life from then on until he was past college, past fighting in World War I, into his career as a professor, all that time, and he was a committed atheist. Doing great, though, other than that. He was accomplished in his field. He was a pretty noteworthy professor. He had a good position and a pretty stable, easy life. But something was missing. And over the course of a number of years, some of his friends began working on him. One of them was the famous author J.R.R. Tolkien, but other people too were asking him questions. And one of the things they asked was, you know, you're an English professor, and most of your favorite authors were Christians. And you listen to them on every other subject, but you ignore them when they talk about Christianity. Have you ever thought about why? And they'd ask him things like that. But they'd also ask him questions about logic, because he was a very logical man. And they'd ask him for his arguments against Christianity, and they'd respond a little bit. And over time, he began to honestly ask questions to see if what he thought about Christianity was true. And he looked at the evidence, and he studied the history and the languages and things like that. And as he looked into it, he realized the claims of Christianity were based in history. And there really was a Jesus. And he really did die on a cross. And there really was an empty grave on Easter Sunday. So maybe he should take it a little more seriously. And he was doing all this thinking through it and being really logical. And along the way, behind the scenes, of course, God was working. And eventually he came to believe in Jesus and became a Christian. And from then on, he devoted a lot of his time and energy to helping other people see what he saw and to answer the questions that they were asking, which were the same thing as him. And that's really what made him a popular author. He was answering questions that he had asked, and other people recognized those answers too. So let me ask you, have you ever had the experience where a teacher is teaching something, and you can be honest about this because all teachers know this is true, you just don't get what they're trying to say? And they explain it again and you still don't get it? Has anyone had that experience besides me? Yeah, I mean, that's normal. And every once in a while we just don't connect. Maybe it's the way they're saying it. Maybe we just aren't hearing it right or misunderstanding something, but every once in a while we get really stuck. Well, have you ever had the experience that you're talking to one of your classmates and they explain it to you and suddenly it makes sense? You know, it might be, what am I supposed to do on this homework assignment? I really don't get it. You talk to your friend, oh, it's easy, and they give you like one sentence and you got it. Lewis said, that's what I'm trying to do with Christianity. He says, I'm like a school kid explaining to a classmate what the teacher's already said. And he says, sometimes someone on that level can communicate better and can recognize what the questions are better than the teacher that's in front. And Lewis wasn't being insulting to teachers or to pastors or theologians, but he was saying, you know, sometimes someone who's on a different level, the same level as the people we're talking to, someone who hasn't gone to school for a bunch of years or doesn't do this as their living, sometimes that's the best person to explain. And he always knew you could tell people, if you got deeper questions, go talk to the people who've studied more. Go talk to pastors or to professors or theologians. You know, that's what I do for a living. You know, there's a place for that. But he says there's also a good place for the ordinary Christian to explain to other people. And people will listen to that more. And that's what we see in books like Mere Christianity. So where this book came from, it came about during World War II. Before it was put together, Lewis had published his book, The Screwtape Letters. And that book made him famous. It was a bestseller in Europe and in the United States, and a lot of people all of a sudden knew about this guy. And during World War II, as England was in chaos, as the Nazis were firing missiles and destroying whole cities, and people were afraid for their lives, the national broadcaster, the British Broadcasting Company, reached out to Lewis and said, we need someone to help inspire and comfort this country. Would you talk on the radio once a week? Just 15 minutes. And what they said was, it's kind of funny. It says, we want to give the people plain practical religion, something really simple and easy that'll make them feel better. And as he starts off, and you probably read this part, C.S. Lewis said, "They asked me to give you plain practical religion, but I'm ignoring that advice because you're not that stupid." He says, "I'm going to give you theology because that just means talking about God. And I think the typical Christian wants to know more about God." And so he picked up some challenging topics and in 15 minutes gave a quick talk on something, and a week later came back and did it again. And almost immediately, these were so popular that they took them and they put them into book form and started selling that. And they actually did that in 3 different parts. So as he was delivering these, all of a sudden a book came out a short while later called Right and Wrong is the Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And a little later came out a book called The Case for Christianity. And finally a book called Beyond Personality. But most people know them because they've put them all into one form. He edited them together and it becomes Mere Christianity. And so as you read through those chapters, each chapter was basically his 15-minute radio talk. And he cleaned up a few things where people asked questions or he thought about it differently. But that's what it was, and it was just designed to answer questions. And it's become an international bestseller. It's continued to publish lots and lots of copies. And I think what people find in this is they find something authentic. Because here's a guy, so when I talk to you about my faith, you don't know me, but I'm a professor, I'm a pastor. This is my job. So people could look at that and say, well, you only do that, Pastor Mueller, because that's your job. You get paid to do that. Now, that's not true. That's not why I do it. But people can think that, whereas when they were listening to an English professor, they knew there was nothing in it for him financially for doing this. This was something he really wanted to do. And it wasn't that his job depended on him doing it or not. He just thought it was really important. And so people thought that was really honest and authentic, and they listened to him. And the other things they liked is because he was answering the kinds of questions that he asked, people recognized them themselves. Like, how do we even know there is a God? And what are we to think about him? And did all this stuff with Jesus really happen? Well, he answered these real questions, and other people were asking him, so they liked it. And then finally, I think there's a combination of things in this book that Lewis brings to it that made it more appealing. And that includes things like it's very logical. So it's not that you know how some people when they talk about religion, they only talk about their feelings? And feelings are important, but feelings come and go. So he didn't say, he's like, it really feels to me like God's real and this is happening. He says, let's look back in history and see if it really happened. And, I'm not sure if Jesus was or wasn't who he says he is. And Lewis says, well, let's look at the evidence, the same we would for anything else in life. And he gets really, really logical. And frankly, that's kind of why the book's a little hard sometimes. But let's really dig in and use top-notch intellectual skills to evaluate, is this true or not? Should we take it seriously? Should we look at it? And to explain it, and so people could look at the evidence themselves a little more clearly. And the other thing I would say for Lewis is, as he writes that, he tends to be very creative. Now, Mere Christianity sounds, more straightforward. Here's what he's got, and we're going to explain it, right? It's not as creative as, say, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the whole thing's a story that tells something there. This is more straightforward, but even at that, he's still telling stories within it. Like the tin soldier, right? The toy figure that suddenly becomes real. He's telling an illustration to let that sink in, and maybe we don't play with tin soldiers, so it doesn't connect with us quite as much. But he's using illustrations and ideas so that we can understand it better. And it's that combination of things that help people understand and get something out of it. So that's kind of the background of where he's going. The other thing I'd say, and Mere Christianity really shows it, because he wasn't a theologian or a pastor, he took the position, I'm going to talk not about the things that sometimes Christians like to argue about or debate about between each other, but I'm going to talk about the basics of Christianity, right? The center that everybody agrees with if they're Christians. And what does he call that? This is the really hard question. The core part of Christianity everybody agrees with? Doesn't get any easier than this question. What was the book you read? Mere Christianity. That's all he means. He means the center part of Christianity, like God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus is the Savior of the world. He dies for us. He rises for us. The basics of Christianity, what we put in the creed, maybe would be another way to think about it. He says he doesn't spend much time talking in any of his books about the Lord's Supper, where Christians have different beliefs. And he doesn't talk about, gee, I wonder what things are going to be like when Jesus comes back. I mean, he mentions it, but he doesn't spend a lot of time on it, because that's something where there's lots of debate among different Christian groups, what exactly is going to happen. But he focuses on the core things that make someone Christian. And so Christians from all over the world looked at that and they say, yeah, that I agree with, and that's teaching what the Bible teaches, and that's part of my faith too. And so that's appealing to people, that mere Christianity. And it's simple. It can be explained. But it's not simplistic, meaning it's not dumbed down. There's complicated parts in it. There's things you have to struggle with. In fact, the end part of mere Christianity, when he starts talking about the Trinity, that's some hard stuff. And he's taking us there on purpose so that we grow in faith. But he says, at the heart of it, Christianity is simple. A child can learn this. But there's stuff we can struggle with and grow with for our whole life. So, last thing I'm going to say before I go to you for questions and discussion. The way Lewis puts this book together, if you think about it, if you break it up a little bit, he's leading people from, I'm open to talking, but I don't know if any of this is true, all the way to, let's look at a really hard topic in Christianity. And so he starts off with that beginning of the book, right and wrong, as a clue to the meaning of the universe. So what he's doing is saying, is there anything, leave religion out of it for a little while. Are there any rules in society and across the world that people agree to pretty much no matter who you are or where you are? And you know what, a lot of people, especially today, a lot of people will say no until you start asking them questions. And the way that Lewis does it, I think is a really good way, is he talks about fairness, right? If you ever, you're in line at a store and someone walks in and tries to go in front of you, do you say, oh, no big deal, I mean, I'll get there eventually? Once in a while some people do that. What do you say? The line's back there. You know, if I'm at the grocery store and someone comes in with a full cart, it says, read the sign, you idiot. 12 items or less. Actually, I don't usually say that. I usually think it. You're an idiot. I said, excuse me, you might want to be over there. It's not right. As I drive home today, if someone cuts me off when it's my turn to go down the road, I get mad, right? It's not right. It's my turn. Even if cars are merging together, one lane goes first, then the next one, you take turns, right? And if someone doesn't do that, we get mad. It's not right. It's not fair, correct? And that's one of those basic hints. I have people all the time, they want to argue, well, there's no objective morality. There's not any sense of right and wrong. It's like, yeah, this is my favorite example of it. Just cut in front of someone in line. Or if you're waiting to buy something, if you're crazy enough to go buy something on Black Friday when crowds of people are lined up to get a cheap TV, try cutting that line, see what happens. No, don't. Please don't. It's dangerous, right? We have that sense of fairness. We think there should be some order to it. But there's more than that. If we look around the world, there are some things that you can find over and over and over again. And there are places where they get broken. But for the most parts of the world, most cultures, most people recognize that murder is wrong. Now, they disagree on what killing counts as murder, going to war, for example, or self-defense, how far is too far. But there aren't many people who would say, yeah, you can just go off and kill anyone you want. That's okay. That's hardly ever the case anywhere. You want the almost universal one? There's nobody around the world who says, you know what, cannibalism's great. Did I surprise you? It's delicious, but it's not. No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that when we're broadcasting. No, for the record, I don't believe in cannibalism. The only time cannibalism has ever really thrived in any area for a short time is when there's been no protein available to people. And it's been part of survival that gets wrapped up in other stuff. It's almost always seen as a huge taboo. You never do it. And there's other things too. There are some universals all around the world. And even when they're different, you can't find a culture or a society or a group that doesn't have some sense of right and wrong, at least for their group. You know, if you get a gang, they've got their own rules and guidelines. Even if they're perfectly horrible to everybody else, within they've got their own sense of order and right and wrong. He says, all over the world people have this. And Lewis says, and people try, sometimes harder than others, to follow it. And they notice when we don't. And they fail. And that's really kind of the essence of that whole first book, right? Right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. There's a sense of law, we would say, that's all around us, and of guilt when people don't follow it. And for our country that likes to think it's not very religious, it's nice and secular, the United States has a huge sense of guilt. And when people don't know how to ground it, or they don't know how that connects to reality, they make up new ways to feel guilty. And all you got to do is look at our world right now. People are inventing ways to feel guilty all over the place. You know, maybe people don't follow traditional morality, but you can feel guilty about your carbon footprint, or about the food that you eat, or about experiences that you've had, or about privilege, or about all kinds of other stuff, some of which are actually all of those are very serious issues in one way or another, but people kind of substitute them as a sense of something's not the way it's supposed to be, and I need to find a way to get better with that. Does that make sense? So Lewis says, if that universal sense is all around us, shouldn't we at least consider that there's someone bigger that's trying to get at us, that put that in us or put that out there? And most cultures of the world have said, yeah, there must be someone out there behind all this law, but all these efforts to do it right, we keep missing. And then he turns to his main argument in what Christians believe. And he says, this is how Christians answer it. And he goes to the most important things. I don't have time in this book to talk about everything in Christianity, so I'm going to tell you the most important thing. Christians say the solution to that problem of guilt is in Christ. And here Lewis answers the question that he'd asked for so long. Who is Jesus? And things haven't changed all that much between Lewis's time and ours. In Lewis's time, people said no one doubted that there was a Jesus and that Jesus was important. What they doubted was that he was God. And so Lewis answered one question, and only one question in this argument. Does it make sense to say that Jesus is a good moral teacher, but that he's not God? Okay, that's the most important argument in the whole book, and that's the one we're going to spend with. So people say this all the time too. Not many people say they hate Jesus. They hate Christians sometimes. They disagree with how people understand Jesus, but most people look at Jesus as there was something good there, even if we don't agree on what he is. He was an ethical teacher. He was a good human. So, does it make sense to say that Jesus was a good teacher? Now, how does Lewis answer that? Well, he adds in one more question. I'm going to ask you to build this argument for me now. So Jesus says that he's God. And people say, but I think he's just a good teacher. So Jesus says this, people say, but he's just a good teacher. Does it make sense to say he's a good teacher if Jesus says that he's God? And Lewis says, yes or no? No. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to say that if Jesus said he's God, and I don't think he's God, it doesn't make sense that he's good. There's something wrong. So if he's not God, what are the choices? How could we explain what he said? Jesus said, I'm God. I don't think he is. So what am I saying about Jesus? He could be a couple things.
You could be saying that he's like lying to everyone that he teaches.
Absolutely. Option number one is that Jesus was lying. Have there ever been people who've said they're God that were lying? Yes, lots of people. Lots of people have said, I'm God, and they weren't. So it's possible that Jesus was just lying. Now, if Jesus was lying, does that make him a good moral teacher? No, it makes him a liar. And you shouldn't listen to someone who lies about something so important as that. So Lewis is saying, don't say he's a good teacher if he's lying to you. If he's a liar, he's a terrible teacher. There's another option, Lewis says. Jesus says he's God. Let's say he's not lying, or doesn't think he's lying. Now, how do we explain that?
He's a lunatic.
He's a lunatic. He's crazy. Yes. Have you ever met someone who said they're God? I mean, I know lots of people who act like they're God. But, I mean, have you ever seriously met someone who said, I'm God? I have. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. Sad. Needed help. Was a homeless person. Had serious mental imbalances. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, but he lived in my community. And a nice man, but out of his mind, mentally ill. And it was very, very sad. He said he was God. Was he? No. Would you go for good, ethical, moral advice to someone like that? No. Someone like that needs compassion. They need our help. They need our care. We did, the community was doing everything they could to take care of this poor man, but he was not in his right mind. It was very clear. If Jesus really believed he was God, but he wasn't, does that make him a good teacher? No. It makes him pathetic. And so if my choice is, I think he's a good teacher, but I reject all his claims, well, that doesn't make sense, does it? So Lewis, in that argument, says, well, if he's not lying, and he's not crazy, and if you look at the evidence, it's pretty clear he's not, well, then what do I have to consider? Just yell it out. Yeah, maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe he's telling the truth. Now, some people have said, let's be really fair about this, some people later on have asked other questions and added them on. And they'll say, well, but maybe it wasn't Jesus lying, maybe it was the disciples lying. And Lewis isn't answering that question. It wasn't even being asked at the time. So we have to be careful. We're only answering that one question. We have what Jesus said, and based on what we have said, and by the way, that's good history that we have what he said. We can trust those words. Based on what he says, should we take his claims seriously? And Lewis's answer is, yeah. Don't just write him off and say, I like Jesus, but I'm not going to listen to his teachings. We need to look closely at what he's saying and at least consider the possibility that he's telling the truth. Now, of course, Lewis believed he was telling the truth. But he wanted to bring his people along so that they would look at that and see it. Now for Lewis, that's exactly what he did. He came to the conclusion, looking at the evidence, Jesus really said he was God. Jesus really did exist in history. He really did die on the cross. His grave really was empty. That's historical fact. His disciples saw him, more than 500 people saw him alive. And Lewis came to the conclusion, he says, as improbable as it might seem, as hard as it might seem to believe, the evidence says this really happened. And this is really true. And we should listen to what Jesus says. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that was going on in Lewis's life as he came to faith than just this. But what he's trying to do is just take care of that one argument. I like Jesus, but I'm not going to listen really to the most important thing that he says. And he says, that's really not a logical thing. Either you reject him as a teacher or you accept him as a teacher, but you can't accept him as a teacher but reject all his teachings. You should probably listen to him more carefully. Right. Now, for the record, since I talked to you about the disciples, there are similar arguments to be made when we're talking about them. Like, what were their words written? Are we sure about the text of the Bible? And by the way, Lewis knew how to read Greek. He was really sure about that answer. And there's good books and things to read about that says that's trustworthy. We can look at the disciples' own testimony, how their lives were changed, how they were willing to die for this message rather than give up for it. So there's reasons to take their words seriously too. What Lewis is really trying to do, though, isn't to say, I'm going to win every argument. He's trying to get people to stop saying, I like Jesus, but I'm not even going to listen to what he says, and to actually listen to what he says and pay attention to it enough that it has a chance to hit their brains and their hearts. So if right and wrong are a clue to the universe, God's solution is in Jesus, who brings forgiveness and gives us holiness for all the times we lived outside of God's law and remakes us as his people. And that's far and away the most important thing in mere Christianity. He then goes on afterwards, and I'm not going to go into the other sections like this, but he goes on afterwards. The next sections of the book are Christian behavior. That was the one I left off before. Christian behavior, where he talks about living in faith as a Christian, and then beyond personality, where he talks about the Trinity. And see, what he's doing now is to say, if we've got the center thing of knowing who Jesus is, now there's lots of other things to talk about and work on, and he spends more time on those in his other books, and of course we do in other venues too. So that's kind of the core of mere Christianity, and I've talked far too long. Let's get some questions. Who's up?
So I had a quick question. So why didn't Jesus just write the Bible himself? Why did he have the disciples and other people write it for him?
That's a good question. Why didn't Jesus write it himself? Why did he have other people write it for him? I think partly is God works through people. And I think it's really one of the really neat things about the Christian faith is it emphasizes just how much it's not dropped from heaven on a parachute, but God works through ordinary things like human words and water and bread and wine and people. So, how does God take care of people today? Very often it's through us, right? And so I think part of it is God involving his people in carrying his word to the world and speaking it. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is the way that Lewis was saying that person in school helping another peer. Now it's another human, a peer, writing to other people, so someone who needs the salvation as much as we do, that's writing to it. I think some of it is, especially in the Gospels, we have 4 different people writing to different audiences and with different viewpoints. So we hear something a little different from Mark than we do from Luke, for example. And they describe things differently, and so I think the Gospels tend to connect differently with different people, is part of it. And then the other thing that I have to wonder if at least some of it's practical, because we think writing is easy, and I mean, it takes time to think of stuff, but this page of notes took me a couple minutes to type out and print, and I can print millions of copies of it if I want, right? And I'm going to throw it away when we're done. It's easy for me. That page, written out by hand with a dip pen on papyrus paper would have been probably half a day's work, at least, just to put something like that down, and that's not even written out properly. To write out, a copy of a book and do it takes days and days and days and days. And where did Jesus spend his time? He was proclaiming it so that people would hear it, and a lot of the people he was talking it to and living with and helping, a lot of those people weren't able to, they didn't have books and they weren't reading anyway. So he was doing it in a way immediately. How do you get the word out the fastest? And then as the church goes on, people were writing down the words of Jesus. But really important, they did it in a time when people still were around who remembered the words being spoken. So it wasn't me sitting down to say, here's what like I'm doing right now, here's what C.S. Lewis said about something. I know that because I've studied, but C.S. Lewis died before I was born, way before you were born. So I didn't hear him, I didn't see him. I've met people who knew him and talked to him. I've learned things from I've met his stepson and other people who knew him and spent time. I've hung out in his house for a little while. So I have secondary contact, but it was people who knew what had happened, and if Matthew had written down something that didn't happen, people would have said, not a chance. Not a chance. But he did it within that time of the eyewitnesses, which is really cool. Okay, going back first, and then we'll come up to you. No, sorry,
So my question is, you're saying that there's all the evidence saying that Jesus existed and that, history is saying it, but what do the people that don't believe in Jesus, what kind of evidence do they have that he doesn't exist? Because, there has to be a whole lot of evidence, but if history is saying that he does exist, what do the, atheists or the other people that don't believe in Jesus, what do they think when they read evidence of Jesus existing?
Sure. Great question and a fair question. So what do non-believers say? What do they have as evidence to say Jesus didn't exist? There are some people who make a case for it, and I'll get that in a second. In my experience, the majority of people who make a case say, we don't know because no one was there. And there's a kind of dishonest thing that happens very often, and by the way, Christians can argue dishonestly too, so I don't want to be unfair to people. But sometimes what I hear a lot is people saying there's no evidence for Jesus except for what's in the Bible. Okay, that's not completely true, but at the same time, there's what's happening is, there's no evidence for George Washington except for all the writings that talk about George Washington. If you decide ahead of time that if something talks about something, you're not going to listen to it, then you're excluding evidence. Now, you can be critical of that evidence. You could say, I don't necessarily believe what's happened, but you can do it. The other way that they'll often do it is by saying those books come from a different time period. So they'll say this. People will say this a lot. They come from way later and when people didn't know, but there's actually not. That's not a valid argument because it's just not true. It's just not true. What it usually comes down, most people don't say Jesus didn't exist. They will say that the resurrection didn't happen. And that they will say that the Bible can't be trusted. And those are arguments that need to be made. And so actually the way I said it very carefully. I absolutely 100% believe Jesus rose from the dead and he was seen by eyewitnesses and it really happened. But there are people who said, I believe all of Jesus' teachings, and then his disciples added in some extra stuff, including that he rose from the dead. What we do know from history, the grave was empty. And we know that not just from the Gospels, but from writings of people who didn't want it to be true, who were coming up with reasons why. So early on, and in some Jewish writings, there's the explanation, his disciples stole the body. Now, I don't believe that happened, and I think the evidence is just the opposite. But what people don't understand when they see that, when critics are saying the grave is empty because someone stole the body, What does that mean about the grave? It's really obvious, but people don't think this way much. It was really empty. If you could see Christianity, unlike most religions, Christianity is falsifiable, meaning it would be possible to disprove Christianity. And if so, I don't want to be a Christian. Okay? The way you disprove Christianity is you produce the body of Jesus. And that opportunity was given and not met because the body was alive. But that's why. That's why. I want to be really clear. People who don't believe are not stupid. Okay? They don't believe. They might actually be using bad arguments. I've heard plenty of Christians use bad arguments. But they're not stupid. They just don't believe yet. So what we need to do as we're talking to people is we need to be loving and respectful. In fact, that's one of the things that the Bible tells us. Be ready to give an answer to people who have questions, but do it with gentleness and respect. Because if we're kind to people, we have a lot more luck. So, all right, up front. I'm almost out of time, too.
So, I was wondering, why would the radio station expect people to be super stupid about religion?
I'm sorry, could you do that? Could we take the mask off just so I could hear you better?
So I was wondering why on the radio station, why they expected people to be super stupid about religion.
So why people on the radio are saying people are stupid about religion? Okay, so one of the most important classes you will hopefully get to take when you get to college is a class in logic or critical thinking or something like that, in which there's a number of ways to argue that we can disagree with all kinds of stuff, but there's a number of things called logical fallacies, of ways that show you're not actually debating with someone, but you're fighting with someone. And so one of the classic logical fallacies is called the ad hominem argument against a person. So you're arguing against a person instead of their beliefs. So we disagree, and what do I say? You're stupid. I win. And what's your response to that? Argue the same way. No, you're stupid. Right? Anyone can say anything, but when you say someone's stupid, you better be able to back that up. For one, that's not the right way to say it. What you really should be saying is, I think you're wrong. Okay. Now let's talk about why you think I'm wrong and what the evidence is for that. Sometimes Christians haven't done ourselves any favors. Sometimes, you ever known people to tell stories about Christianity where they kind of seem like they're making some stuff up to make it look better? Like, I've known lots of people who've talked about things like their miracles, and I look at it, I'm a pastor, and I look at it, and I believe in miracles, and I look at what they're saying, it's like, no. I just found my keys, it's a miracle. Really, they're right here. Isn't that amazing? And for my next trick, I can find my phone. People will say, and sometimes they're saying it because they're not being very clear about what they're saying, about what they're doing. Sometimes people do say stupid stuff, both Christians and non-Christians. But when someone just says Christianity is stupid, that's almost always an indication that they've never looked at what it really is, or how much their life has been affected by it. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, why did the radio station ask Lewis to teach it to people like they were stupid? Because they didn't really, I don't want to judge what was in their hearts. I think they were thinking like marketers, and they thought, we don't want to be controversial, and I think marketing people sometimes think people are really stupid. Advertisers. And they thought, just give people what they want to hear, make it nice and easy, something sentimental, something makes them feel good, but don't make it hard. Don't make it think. People just want to know everything's going to be okay. And people did want to know everything was going to be okay, but sometimes just telling people, everything's going to be okay isn't the right answer. So all of you guys are wearing masks, and I'll put mine on in a second. Is everything, don't worry about COVID, everything's going to be okay. Is that a good answer? Not usually. Don't worry about COVID, be smart. Wear your masks, wash your hands, let's get our vaccines when we can, protect other people, we'll get through it. That's different than everything's going to be okay. That's got some substance to it, right? If Christianity is just, oh, don't worry, everything's fine, that's not really real. But if we get to what it really says, God really engages with our deepest problems and challenges. And Lewis didn't claim he was answering all the questions, but what he did think was, if we turn on our brains as well as our faith, and we look at this, and we're willing to think about things hard and even wrestle and study with things, there's a lot more answers than people think there are. And Christianity stands up to criticism. I've known people like Lewis, people who are complete atheists and reject all things and didn't look at it, and later on look at the evidence, and it's often because a Christian was consistently nice to them, and look at the evidence and say, at least maybe. And God works, sometimes slowly, but God does work. So we're out of time, aren't we? So that's the problem of a school schedule. Been fun being with you guys. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller. If you guys need to run to the restroom, go do it real quick, but be back here in those, or actually, how many of you have to go to the restroom? Probably all of you. Go. Aaron, go.